My family dismissed me as just a secretary. I secretly built $1 million empire. Today, they were horrified when they walked into my boardroom. The look on Uncle Robert's face was worth every second of the last 10 years. His mouth opened and closed like a beached fish gasping for air, his perfectly manicured appearance crumbling as realization dawned. Beside him, my cousin Ethan's smug smile had frozen in place, a brittle mask about to shatter. Aunt Patricia's perfectly lined eyes widened to comic proportions, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the shock distorting her features. "You're the secretary," she finally sputtered, as if trying to reconcile the woman in the Chanel power suit standing at the head of the conference table with the meek assistant she'd dismissed for a decade. I smiled, savoring the moment. "No, Aunt Patricia. I'm the CEO. I always have been. But perhaps I should start at the beginning." The Wilson family's annual reunion was exactly as suffocating as I remembered. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead in my aunt's oversized mansion, reflecting off designer dresses and expensive watches worn by relatives who measured worth in square footage and stock portfolios. The air was thick with a peculiar mix of expensive perfume and superiority that seemed to follow my family everywhere they went. I stood in the corner, watching my cousins compete for attention with stories of their latest achievements. My simple black dress, carefully chosen to help me blend into the background, felt like armor against their judgment. I'd perfected the art of invisibility at these gatherings, present enough to avoid comments about my absence, but unremarkable enough to escape scrutiny. "Olivia." My Aunt Patricia's voice cut through the chatter like a diamond through glass. "I almost didn't see you there. Still working as a secretary, dear?" I took a small sip of champagne, hiding my smile behind the glass. The champagne, ironically, came from a vineyard I'd quietly acquired last year. "Administrative assistant, actually." "Oh," she raised a perfectly manicured eyebrow. "Still at that little consulting firm? What was it called again?" "Summit Solutions," I replied quietly, deliberately keeping my voice soft, unassuming. My cousin Ethan, fresh from making partner at his father's law firm at the ripe old age of 32, and only after his father had threatened to withdraw funding from the firm, couldn't resist joining in. He sidled up, bourbon in hand, his expensive watch deliberately visible as he raised his glass. "Come on, Liv, I could get you a real job, something with actual career potential. My firm's always looking for competent admins." The condescension in his voice made my skin crawl, but I maintained my facade. I thought about the stack of contracts waiting for my signature back at my office, my real office, not the carefully maintained cover I showed the world. Documents for mergers worth billions, strategies that would reshape entire industries, decisions that would affect thousands of employees. "I'm happy where I am, thanks." "Happy?" Aunt Patricia's laugh could have cut glass. "Darling, you're wasting your potential. Your cousins are all executives, partners, real business people, and you're still pushing paper for someone else. If only they knew that someone else was me." The story of how I built my empire in secret started 10 years ago in this very house. I was fresh out of business school, armed with an MBA and a revolutionary idea for restructuring failing companies. I'd spent months perfecting my pitch, convinced that my family's vast business connections would help launch my career. Instead, they laughed. "Consulting?" Uncle Robert had scoffed, swirling his 20-year-old scotch. "Leave that to the big firms, girl. Join the family business, start in the mail room, work your way up like everyone else." Everyone else meant my male cousins, of course. The Wilson family's idea of success was strictly defined and strictly controlled. They built their fortune through a network of companies, each headed by a carefully chosen male heir. Women were expected to marry well or take subordinate positions, nothing more. I remember sitting in my car afterward, hands shaking with rage and humiliation. Tears threatened, but I refused to let them fall. I was done crying over the Wilson family's archaic values. That night, I made 2 decisions that would change everything. First, I would build my own company without their help or knowledge. Second, I would make them regret every dismissive word. Summit Solutions began in a tiny office above a Chinese restaurant. The smell of Sichuan spices permeated everything during those first months. My savings covered the rent, barely, but I had something more valuable than money, knowledge and determination fueled by righteous anger. I understood how companies worked, how they failed, and most importantly, how to fix them. I'd studied business models obsessively, analyzing case studies of corporate turnarounds until my eyes burned. What established consulting firms saw as unsalvageable, I saw as untapped potential. My first client was a small manufacturing firm on the verge of bankruptcy. The owner, a weathered man named Johnson, had been turned down by every major consulting firm in the city. When he walked into my humble office, skepticism radiated from him. I could almost hear his thoughts. This is who's going to save my company? A young woman working above a restaurant? Why should I trust you with my family's business? He'd asked bluntly. Because I have nothing to lose and everything to prove, I replied honestly. And because I see value in your company that others have missed. I spent 3 months restructuring their operations, streamlining processes, and negotiating with creditors. I worked 18-hour days, sometimes sleeping on the office couch rather than going home. 6 months later, they were profitable again. Johnson's company became my first success story. He paid me double my requested fee and referred me to 2 other struggling businesses. Word spread quietly through business circles about the mysterious consulting firm that could save dying companies. I hired carefully, choosing people who shared my vision and my discretion. Every employee signed ironclad NDAs that prohibited them from discussing the company's structure or leadership. My name never appeared on any public documents. I was simply the CEO, a shadowy figure even to most of my own employees. As Summit Solutions grew, I maintained my cover as a low-level employee. I kept the tiny office above the restaurant, even as we expanded into a sleek downtown headquarters. It became my personal workspace, a reminder of where I'd started. When family members asked about my job, I described mundane administrative tasks, watching their eyes glaze over with disinterest. I'd mastered the art of making my work sound as boring as possible. I mostly managed the CEO's calendar and handle correspondence, I'd say with a practiced sigh. It pays the bills. The deception wasn't just about pride, it was strategy. The Wilson family's business empire was built on acquiring struggling companies at rock-bottom prices. My firm's specialty was saving those same companies before they became vulnerable to hostile takeovers. We worked in the shadows, quietly thwarting my family's predatory practices while building our own success. There were close calls, of course. Once, Uncle Robert visited the Summit Solutions office for a meeting with the CEO. I'd arranged everything meticulously, hiring an actor to play the role of my assistant while I pretended to be his secretary. I served coffee, took notes, and remained invisible as I'd been trained to do my whole life. Uncle Robert never looked at me twice. Now, 10 years later, Summit Solutions was one of the most influential consulting firms in the industry. We had offices in 12 cities, a client list that included Fortune 500 companies, and a reputation for turning failing businesses into success stories. We managed over $122 billion in client assets, with a 94% success rate in corporate restructuring. And not one of my smirking relatives had any idea. More champagne, dear? Aunt Patricia's voice yanked me back to the present, to the family reunion I'd been enduring for the past 3 hours. Though perhaps you should stick to water. I imagine your salary doesn't leave much room for expensive tastes. I accepted the champagne with a practiced smile, my fingers lightly brushing the crystal stem from my own vineyard. Thank you, Aunt Patricia. How's Uncle Robert's new acquisition going? Williams Manufacturing, wasn't it? Her smile faltered slightly, the corner of her mouth twitching. There have been some complications. Nothing Robert can't handle, of course. What she didn't know was that those complications were my doing. Williams Manufacturing had been a target of my uncle's hostile takeover attempt for months. They'd reached out to Summit Solutions 3 months ago, desperate for help. Now, they were implementing our restructuring plan. Their stock price was rising, and Uncle Robert's attempt to seize control was falling apart. I heard they hired some consulting firm, my cousin Ethan added, his tone dismissive. Probably throwing good money after bad. Those consultants are all the same, big promises, no results. I hid another smile behind my glass. Summit Solutions' fee for saving Williams Manufacturing was more than Ethan would make in 5 years at his father's firm. Oh, which firm? I asked innocently. Summit something? He waved dismissively. Nobody important. Dad says their CEO won't even show their face, probably some trust fund kid playing at business. My phone buzzed in my clutch, and I excused myself to check it. A message from my actual assistant, Maya, appeared on the screen. Emergency meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. Wilson Ventures representatives requesting merger discussion Williams Manufacturing. Urgent response needed. I scanned the message twice, realization dawning. They were finally admitting defeat with Williams Manufacturing. After failing to acquire the company, they were now seeking a merger, which would require approval from Williams Consulting Firm, my firm. Tomorrow morning, my family would walk into a meeting expecting to strong-arm their way into a merger. Instead, they would find themselves facing the secretary they'd dismissed for the past decade, except I wouldn't be bringing coffee. I would be sitting at the head of the table. A strange calm settled over me. 10 years of preparation, of careful deception and strategic positioning, had led to this moment. "Everything all right, dear?" Aunt Patricia asked, noticing my expression. I finished my champagne and gave her my brightest smile. "Perfect, actually. I should head home early. Meeting tomorrow." "Oh, taking notes for someone important?" she asked with that familiar condescending smile. "Something like that," I replied, already planning what I would wear, a tailored Chanel suit in deep navy, a power color for a power move. Something exactly like that. The next morning, I stood in my private elevator, ascending to Summit Solutions' executive floor. Gone was the simple black dress from last night's reunion. Today, I wore armor of a different kind, the Chanel suit, Louboutin heels that added 3 inches to my height, and a confidence built on a decade of success. My assistant, Maya, waited at the elevator doors with a tablet and a knowing smile. She'd been with me for 5 years, one of the few people who knew the full extent of my deception. "The Wilson Ventures team arrived early," she reported as we walked. "Your uncle seems particularly anxious to meet Summit's CEO. I'm sure he is." I checked my reflection in a glass wall. "Perfect. Are they in the main conference room?" "Yes, along with Mr. Harrison from Williams Manufacturing." Maya's eyes sparkled with anticipation. "Your cousin Ethan is there too. Apparently, he insisted on handling the legal aspects personally." I smiled, remembering Ethan's condescending offer of a real job just yesterday. "Who else from the family?" "Your Aunt Patricia came as moral support, though she's not officially part of the meeting. And your cousin James is representing Wilson Ventures' finance department." A perfect audience. I checked my watch. 8:57 a.m. Have they been offered coffee? Your aunt complained that there was no one to serve it. Maya's grin widened. I told them the administrative assistant would be in shortly. I almost laughed. For 10 years, I'd played the role of invisible support staff. Whenever family members visited the office, they never looked closely at the quiet woman who brought their coffee or took their coats. It had been the perfect cover. "Give me 2 minutes," I said, "then bring in the contracts." I could hear voices through the conference room's heavy doors, my uncle's authoritative tone, and Patricia's sharp laugh, Ethan's smug commentary. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the doors open. The conversation stopped abruptly. My uncle sat at one end of the long table, apparently having assumed the power position. Ethan and James flanked him, both in expensive suits that screamed family money. Aunt Patricia perched nearby, examining her manicure with practiced disinterest. Mr. Harrison from Williams Manufacturing sat alone on the other side, looking uncomfortable. I felt every eye in the room turn to me, but not a single family member truly saw me. They saw the role I'd played for years, the administrative assistant, the coffee fetcher, the note-taker. Finally, Aunt Patricia sighed. "We've been waiting for coffee," she stopped, really looking at me for the first time. "Olivia, what are you wearing? And why aren't you carrying coffee?" I walked calmly to the head of the table, the seat directly opposite Uncle Robert. My heels clicked purposefully on the polished floor, each step deliberate. "I don't serve coffee anymore, Aunt Patricia." I pulled out the chair and sat down. "In fact, I never really did." "What is this?" Uncle Robert demanded, his face already flushing with irritation. "Where is Summit's CEO? We were promised a meeting with the actual decision-maker." "You have been." I sat down, enjoying the confusion on their faces. "I am the CEO of Summit Solutions. I have been since I founded the company 10 years ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. James dropped his pen. Aunt Patricia's perfectly maintained composure cracked completely, her eyes widening in disbelief. Uncle Robert's face had gone from pink to red. "This is absurd," he finally sputtered. "You're a secretary." "No," I said calmly, "that was a cover. A very effective one, apparently, since none of you ever looked past it. You were so convinced I couldn't be successful that you never noticed I already was." Maya chose that moment to enter with a stack of contracts. She distributed them efficiently, then took her place standing behind my chair. "These documents," I continued, "outline the terms under which Summit Solutions will consider approving the merger between Wilson Ventures and Williams Manufacturing." "Consider approving?" Ethan sputtered. "You can't be serious. This is a joke, right? Some kind of elaborate prank?" I pulled out my phone and projected Summit's latest financial statements onto the wall screen. The numbers spoke for themselves: billions in managed assets, a global client list, profit margins that dwarf those of Wilson Ventures. Summit Solutions currently manages over $122 billion in client assets. We have a 94% success rate in corporate restructuring, and our approval is required for any major changes to Williams Manufacturing's business structure. I smiled at my stunned relatives. Does that look like a joke to you? This is impossible, Aunt Patricia whispered. You're nothing. You've always been nothing. The words should have hurt, but instead, they felt like the final validation of my strategy. That's exactly what you were meant to think. I turned to Mr. Harrison. Would you like to explain to my family why you chose Summit Solutions over Wilson Ventures' original offer? Mr. Harrison straightened in his chair. Summit's reputation is unparalleled. When Wilson Ventures attempted their hostile takeover, Summit's restructuring plan saved our company. We've increased profits by 47% since implementing their strategies. Restructuring plan? James looked like he might faint. The plan that destroyed our acquisition attempt. That was you? Among others. I began listing cases on my fingers. Peterson Electronics, which you tried to acquire last year. Maritime Shipping, which you underbid on last quarter. The Davidson Group, which mysteriously recovered just before you could buy them out. I leaned forward. For 10 years, I've been quietly undermining every predatory acquisition attempt your company has made. Uncle Robert's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. You deliberately sabotaged family business. No, I corrected, I built my own business. One that helps companies survive instead of devouring them for parts. The fact that it interfered with your plans was just a karmic bonus. This is ridiculous, Ethan declared, standing up. I'm calling our lawyers. Sit down, Ethan. My voice carried an authority that made him freeze. You really should read those contracts in front of you. The ones your firm spent months trying to secure for this meeting. I watched realization dawn on his face. That's right. Your law firm's biggest client this year? That was me too. Maya stepped forward with another document. This is a summary of Summit's current market position and liquid assets. You'll note that we're now in a position to acquire controlling interest in Wilson Ventures, if we choose. The room erupted in chaos. Aunt Patricia was practically hyperventilating, her manicured hand clutching at her pearl necklace. James was frantically checking the numbers on his phone, his eyes growing wider with each confirmation. Ethan had collapsed back into his chair, looking shell-shocked, his legal training useless in the face of this development. This is blackmail, Uncle Robert growled, his fist pounding the table. No, I said quietly, this is business. The kind you taught me I'd never be capable of handling. I stood up, smoothing my jacket. You have until 5 p.m. today to review the merger terms. They're very generous considering our position. If you decline, Summit Solutions will begin purchasing Wilson Ventures stock on the open market tomorrow morning. I headed for the door, then paused, unable to resist one final twist of the knife. Oh, and Aunt Patricia? That champagne you so graciously offered me last night? I own the vineyard that produces it. Bought it last year. I smiled sweetly. The coffee you were so desperate for this morning? That chain too. Turns out my salary does leave room for expensive tastes after all. The door closed behind me on their stunned faces. In my private office, I finally allowed myself a moment to process what had just happened. 10 years of careful deception, of playing the invisible underachiever, had led to this moment. I sank into my chair, trembling slightly as the adrenaline began to ebb. Maya appeared with a real cup of coffee, my favorite blend from my own coffee chain. Was it worth the wait? She asked, setting the cup on my desk. I thought about all the times I'd served coffee in this very office, watching my family dismiss me, underestimate me, write me off as nothing more than a secretary. Every single second, I replied, taking a sip and savoring both the flavor and the moment. My phone buzzed, messages already pouring in from family members who must have heard about the meeting. I silenced it without looking. They'd have plenty of time to process their new reality. Right now, I had an empire to run, and for the first time in 10 years, I could finally do it without hiding who I really was. The liberation was intoxicating. For a decade, I'd maintained two personas, the meek administrative assistant and the mysterious, powerful CEO. Now those two lives were merging, and I could finally step fully into my power without pretense. Maya, I said, straightening in my chair, let's call the executive team together. It's time they met the real CEO. The next 48 hours were exactly what you'd expect when a family built on power and appearances suddenly discovers they're not at the top of the food chain anymore. The messages started pouring in almost immediately after the meeting. Aunt Patricia, darling, let's discuss this over lunch. You always were my favorite niece. Ethan, come on, Liv, we were just joking around. Family should stick together. James, you can't do this to us. We're blood. I ignored them all, focusing instead on the rapid-fire emails from Wilson Ventures board members. They weren't stupid, they could see which way the wind was blowing. By noon, they had scheduled an emergency board meeting. By 3, they had voted to accept Summit's merger terms. Uncle Robert, predictably, didn't go quietly. He barged into my office unannounced the following morning, his face flushed with anger. "You've betrayed this family," his voice echoed through my office as security moved to intervene. I waved them off, letting him have his moment. "Actually," I said, not looking up from my computer, "I'd say I learned from this family. Isn't this exactly what you taught us? Seize power, eliminate competition, never show weakness. We gave you everything," he spat. That made me laugh, a genuine laugh that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside. "You gave me nothing. Less than nothing. You taught me that I would never be good enough, that my only value was in supporting the men in the family." I stood up, meeting his gaze directly. "So I built something better. By deceiving everyone. For a decade, I finally looked up at him, by letting you deceive yourselves. You saw exactly what you expected to see, a quiet, unambitious woman who knew her place. That was your mistake, not mine." The fight seemed to drain out of him suddenly. He sank into one of my visitor chairs, looking older than I'd ever seen him. "Why reveal yourself now? You could have continued operating in secret." "Because it was time." I closed my laptop. "Williams Manufacturing isn't the only company you're trying to acquire. There's Thompson Electronics, Maritime Solutions, at least 3 others, companies with good people, solid products that just need help restructuring. I'm tired of watching you destroy them." "It's business," he protested weakly. "No, it's greed. And it stops now." I handed him a folder. "These are the final merger terms. Summit Solutions will acquire a controlling interest in Wilson Ventures. We'll restructure the company to focus on building businesses up, not tearing them down. You can stay on as a consultant if you accept the new direction. If not, your golden parachute is outlined on page 3. He opened the folder with trembling hands. "You thought of everything." "I learned from the best," I smiled without warmth, though not in the way you intended. After he left, Maya brought in a stack of newspapers. Summit's revelation was already making headlines. Secret CEO revealed, how one woman built $1 billion empire in secret. Wilson family shocked, the hidden success story they never saw coming. From secretary to CEO, the decade-long deception that fooled Wall Street. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message that actually mattered. My mother, who had divorced Uncle Robert's brother years ago and distanced herself from the Wilson family's toxicity, had sent a single line. "I always knew you would show them." I felt tears prick my eyes for the first time in years. My mother had always been my silent supporter, the one who'd encouraged me to pursue business school despite the family's dismissal. She'd been the only one who believed in me when I'd graduated at the top of my class, the only one who'd hugged me and said, "You're going to change the world." I'd kept her in the dark about Summit Solutions to protect her, knowing the family would pressure her for information if they suspected anything. I texted back, "Dinner tonight? I have so much to tell you." Her reply was immediate, "I've been waiting 10 years for this dinner." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of changes. Wilson Ventures board enthusiastically embraced Summit's new direction. Their stock price jumped 40% on the announcement of the merger. Companies that had feared the Wilson name now sought partnerships. The press couldn't get enough of the story. I received interview requests from major business publications, television networks, even documentary filmmakers. After careful consideration, I agreed to a single in-depth interview with Business Weekly, using it as a platform to discuss not just my deception, but the broader issues of gender discrimination in corporate America. "Did you really need to maintain the charade for 10 years? The interviewer asked. "Would you be interviewing me if I hadn't?" I countered. "Would this story be front-page news if it were about a man who started a successful company? Or is it only remarkable because I had to pretend to be powerless in order to build power?" Aunt Patricia tried to spin it as a heartwarming family success story. "We always knew Olivia had potential," she told one reporter. "This just proves that the Wilson spirit of entrepreneurship runs in the blood." I responded by releasing archived video of last year's family reunion where she had spent 20 minutes explaining to everyone why I would never amount to anything. The footage went viral. She stopped giving interviews after that. Ethan attempted damage control in his own way, claiming he had been in on it all along. Unfortunately for him, too many people had witnessed his shocked face in that conference room. His law firm's other clients began questioning his judgment. Within a month, he was quietly asked to take a leave of absence. James adapted the fastest, approaching me with a business proposal just 2 weeks after the revelation. We could dominate the market together, he suggested over an awkward lunch. The Wilson Summit Alliance would be unstoppable. That's not what Summit Solutions is about, I told him. We don't dominate. We elevate. The real changes came in quieter moments. The young intern who tearfully thanked me for showing her that success didn't require compromising her principles. The female executives who started reaching out, sharing their own stories of being underestimated. The business schools that invited me to speak about building ethical success in a cutthroat world. 3 months after the revelation, I stood on a stage accepting the Business Innovation Award. Looking out at the audience, I saw my mother sitting in the front row, beaming with pride. Behind her sat several of my former administrative assistants, all women who had helped maintain my cover while building their own careers within Summit. Success isn't about who has the most power, I told the crowd. It's about how you use the power you have. For 10 years, I played a role that made powerful people underestimate me. I could have revealed myself sooner, but I chose to wait until Summit Solutions was strong enough to create real change. The applause was thunderous, but the real satisfaction came later that evening. I was working late in my office when Maya brought in an interesting piece of news. Uncle Robert had just announced his retirement. His resignation letter included an unexpected paragraph. My niece taught me that true business success isn't measured in acquisitions or assets, but in the positive impact we create. I regret that it took losing control of my company to learn this lesson. I leaned back in my chair, thinking about the long game I had played. 10 years of careful planning, of swallowing pride and playing small, had led to this moment. Summit Solutions wasn't just successful, it was changing how business was done. 6 months after the revelation, I hosted the Wilson family reunion in Summit's main conference room, the same room where I had served coffee countless times, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to show them who I really was. The atmosphere was markedly different from previous gatherings. Gone were the competitive boasts and status displays. In their place was a cautious respect, perhaps even a touch of fear. Most of the family came, curiosity overcoming pride. Aunt Patricia arrived in a subdued navy suit rather than her usual ostentatious designer wear. Uncle Robert attended with his wife but stayed mostly silent, nursing a glass of scotch in the corner. Ethan was conspicuously absent, having taken a sabbatical in Europe to escape the professional fallout. My mother, radiant in a red dress I'd had designed especially for her, moved through the room with newfound confidence. The Wilson family had always treated her as an outsider after her divorce. Now they clustered around her, eager to share in her reflected glory. "They're like weather vanes," she whispered to me as we watched them mingle. "Always turning to face the direction of power. Then let's use that power for something worthwhile," I replied. I clinked my glass to call for attention, and the room fell silent. "Welcome to the new headquarters of the Wilson Summit Foundation," I announced. "As part of our corporate restructuring, 20% of all profits from the merged companies will now fund educational opportunities for young women in business." I watched the reactions ripple across the room, surprise, confusion, and from some of the younger cousins, genuine enthusiasm. "The old Wilson legacy was built on taking advantage of weakness," I continued. "Our new legacy will be about creating strength. I'll be accepting applications for the Foundation's Board of Directors starting next week. I hope many of you will consider contributing your talents to something bigger than quarterly profits." Later, as the party wound down, Uncle Robert approached me. He seemed smaller somehow, less imposing than the man who had dominated family gatherings for decades. "You've won," he said quietly. "Completely and thoroughly." "It was never about winning," I replied. "It was about changing the game." He studied me for a long moment. "I underestimated you." "We all did." "Yes," I agreed. "And that was your biggest mistake." As the last guest departed, I found myself alone in the conference room. I ran my fingers along the polished wood of the table, remembering all the meetings where I'd stood silently against the wall, taking notes, serving coffee, watching and learning. Maya knocked on the open door. "Your 4 p.m. is here, the CEO of Thomson Electronics, the company your uncle was trying to acquire." I smiled. "Show them in. And Maya, bring coffee for everyone, the good stuff from our chain." As I stood to greet my visitors, I caught my reflection in the window. No more hiding, no more playing small. I had built something remarkable, not despite my family's dismissal but because of it. They had taught me that power doesn't always look like what people expect. Sometimes it looks like a quiet woman in a simple black dress, serving coffee and taking notes while building an empire right under everyone's nose. The tabloids called it revenge. The business papers called it strategic genius. But for me, it was simply justice served, one corporate takeover at a time, with a side of perfectly brewed coffee. And somewhere in a small office above a Chinese restaurant, my original desk still sits. I keep it as a reminder that success doesn't always wear designer labels or demand attention. Sometimes it works quietly, patiently, building something extraordinary while the world looks the other way. That's the real secret to success, not the power you show, but the power you build when no one's watching. The annual Businesswoman of the Year gala was nothing like the Wilson family reunions I'd endured for most of my life. Instead of forced smiles and backhanded compliments, the room buzzed with genuine conversation and energy. Women from every sector of business, finance, tech, manufacturing, consulting, gathered to celebrate achievements that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. I adjusted my emerald evening gown as I prepared to take the stage. The award, a crystal sculpture of a woman with arms raised in triumph, gleamed under the spotlights. And now, the host announced, our keynote speaker, the woman who redefined success and secrecy in corporate America, Summit Solutions founder and CEO, Olivia Wilson. The applause was deafening as I approached the podium. I spotted my mother in the front row, next to Maya, who had recently been promoted to Chief Operating Officer. Several rows back sat a group of young women, the first recipients of the Wilson Summit Foundation scholarships. A year ago, I was serving coffee at my family's business meetings. Today, I'm running those meetings. The crowd laughed appreciatively. But the real change isn't in who sits at the head of the table. It's in how we define the purpose of being there in the first place. I scanned the room, making eye contact with aspiring entrepreneurs and established executives alike. The old business model was built on competition, winner takes all, success measured in acquisitions and assets. The new model must be built on collaboration, on lifting others as we climb, on measuring success by the positive impact we create. I paused, thinking of Uncle Robert, who had finally embraced his consulting role at Wilson Summit and was now mentoring young business owners. Even those who once dismissed us can become allies in building a better business world. Sometimes, all it takes is showing them what's possible. After the speech, as I mingled with guests, a young woman approached me tentatively. She couldn't have been more than 25, dressed in a rented gown, hands clutching a worn portfolio. Ms. Wilson, she said, voice trembling slightly, your story changed my life. I've been hiding my business ideas because everyone told me they wouldn't work. But after hearing about you. She opened the portfolio, revealing detailed plans for an innovative sustainable packaging company. I decided to stop hiding. I recognized in her the same fire, the same determination that had driven me a decade ago. Schedule a meeting with my office next week, I told her. I think Summit Solutions might be interested in what you're building. Her eyes widened. Really? But it's still so small. The biggest empires, I said with a smile, often start in the smallest spaces. Mine began above a Chinese restaurant with nothing but ambition and the advantage of being underestimated. Later that night, as my driver took me home, I reflected on the journey of the past year. The merger had transformed both companies, creating a business model that other corporations were now scrambling to emulate. The Wilson Summit Foundation had funded educational opportunities for over 100 young women. And perhaps most surprisingly, my family had slowly begun to change. My phone buzzed with a text from Aunt Patricia, saw you on the Business Channel tonight. The foundation is doing remarkable work. Your uncle and I have decided to match this year's scholarship funding. I smiled to myself. Some transformations took longer than others, but they were possible. The impossible part was believing you could make them happen. As the car pulled up to my penthouse, I gazed up at the illuminated Summit Solutions logo crowning the building. From secretary to CEO, from invisible to influential, from dismissed to dominant, my journey had come full circle. Tomorrow I would return to the office I'd built, lead the company I'd created, and continue reshaping the business world in my image, one rescued company, one funded scholarship, one shattered stereotype at a time. But tonight, as I stepped into my home and kicked off my heels, I allowed myself a moment of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. 10 years of patient strategy, of swallowed pride, of playing the long game had culminated in complete vindication. I poured myself a glass of champagne from my vineyard and stepped onto the balcony overlooking the city. The lights stretched in every direction, a constellation of possibilities. Somewhere out there, other underestimated people were building their own empires in secret, waiting for their moment to emerge from the shadows. I raised my glass to them, to the power of patience, to the strength found in being underestimated. The tabloids would continue calling it a revenge story. Business schools would study it as strategic genius. But in my heart, I knew the truth was simpler and more profound. I had refused to be defined by others' limitations. In the end, That was the greatest success of all, not the company I'd built or the family I'd humbled, but the narrative I'd reclaimed. My story, written in my terms, by my rules. I smiled, remembering the look on Uncle Robert's face when I'd revealed myself as the CEO. That single moment of realization, when his worldview shattered and reformed around a truth he'd been too arrogant to see, had been worth every second of the journey. My phone buzzed with an email from Maya, tomorrow's schedule confirmed. Thompson Electronics signing at 9 a.m. Wilson Summit Foundation board meeting at 11. Lunch with Business Innovators Council at 1. Your mother called, she's taking you to dinner at 7 to celebrate the anniversary. 1 year since the revelation. 1 year of operating in the light instead of the shadows. 1 year of watching my strategy unfold exactly as planned. I typed back, perfect. Have the Thompson contracts on my desk by 8. And order the celebration cake for the foundation meeting, chocolate, with just a secretary written in icing. Maya's reply came instantly, delicious irony for dessert. Consider it done. I laughed, a genuine laugh filled with the joy of victory and the promise of what was still to come. The empire I'd built in secret was now growing in the open, stronger and more influential than ever before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new acquisitions, new opportunities to reshape the business landscape according to my vision. But tonight, I savored the sweetness of truth revealed and justice served. The Wilson family had dismissed me as just a secretary. I had secretly built a billion-dollar empire. And when they walked into my boardroom, their horror had been the first payment in a debt long overdue. As for the rest of the debt, I would collect it one success at a time, each achievement another reminder of the power they had failed to see, the potential they had arrogantly dismissed. They had taught me well, these relatives who thought so little of me. They had shown me exactly what not to become, precisely how not to lead, perfectly how not to succeed. And for that unintentional lesson, the most valuable of all, I raised my glass in one final toast. To the Wilson family, I whispered to the night sky. Thank you for underestimating me. Then I turned and walked back inside, toward the future I had created through determination, deception, and the delicious patience of a woman with nothing to lose and everything to prove. My empire awaited. And this time, everyone would see it coming.